The ambient temperature in the Austin boardroom was exactly 68 degrees. My brother stood at the front of the mahogany table. He pitched his logistics startup to an aggressive equity firm. He pointed directly at me and chuckled. He told the investors I was just his little brother. He said I handled basic server maintenance. He claimed I dropped out of college because I lacked ambition. My mother sat next to him and nodded in solemn agreement. They enjoyed framing my sacrifice as a personal failure. I am Julian Thorne. I am 29 years old. I live in Austin, Texas. I am a Principal Risk Actuary for Vanguard Holdings. My specialty is distressed debt restructuring and corporate acquisitions. I evaluate failing companies and systematically dismantle their executive boards. My brother did not know my firm was auditing him. He did not know I orchestrated this specific evaluation meeting. I did not flush with anger or interrupt his narrative. Anger is a useless metric that distorts objective data. I simply observed his elevated respiration and pupil dilation. He was terrified because his operational burn rate was unsustainable. He was losing exactly $42,500 every single week. He desperately needed our capital to avoid immediate bankruptcy. Where are you right now as you realize your family only values what they can extract from you? Drop your current city and the exact time in the comments below. 7 years ago, I enrolled in computer science at Stanford. My tuition was fully funded by my late grandfather. My parents legally forced me to sign over that trust. They claimed my brother needed seed capital for his application. They gaslit me into believing family loyalty superseded my education. I officially withdrew and surrendered exactly $185,400 directly into his control. They assumed I would permanently remain a subservient secondary character. They mistakenly believed my quiet nature equated to severe intellectual weakness. I spent the next 7 years building an elite career in risk modeling. I learned how to weaponize contracts and leverage corporate debt. I watched my brother burn my inheritance with complete incompetence. Now he was begging my firm for a financial lifeline. I stared at his projected revenue slides with cold detachment. I knew every metric on the screen was heavily fabricated. I had already secured his master ledger through digital auditing. I was about to become his majority shareholder and his absolute worst nightmare. The family dynamic was always a zero-sum game. Every resource was aggressively diverted to guarantee my brother's success. His name is Harrison. He was the golden child with undeniable charismatic charm. I was the quiet variable they easily manipulated. When he launched his supply chain logistics company, he required massive initial capital. He burned through his own inheritance in exactly 14 months. He spent $92,000 on custom office furniture alone. He did not secure a single active shipping contract. My mother orchestrated the extraction of my trust fund. She utilized highly targeted emotional extortion. She cried on the kitchen floor for exactly 3 consecutive days. She claimed my Stanford degree was a selfish vanity project. She stated Harrison's business would eventually employ our entire family. I signed the transfer authorization forms on a Tuesday morning. The wire transfer moved $185,400 into his corporate operating account. That was my tuition, my housing, and my future. I packed my belongings and moved into a cheap studio apartment. I secured an entry-level position as a data entry clerk. I worked 90 hours a week while studying actuarial science at night. I passed all 7 professional certification exams on my first attempt. Harrison continued to mismanage the logistics startup with spectacular arrogance. He leased a fleet of 20 commercial delivery vans. He did not purchase commercial gap insurance for the vehicles. He hired his college fraternity brothers as senior regional managers. They possessed zero experience in freight routing or supply chain optimization. Whenever his operational deficit reached critical levels, my parents intervened. They leveraged their own home equity to cover his payroll. They extracted another $65,000 from their retirement portfolios. They demanded I contribute portions of my corporate salary to save him. I transferred exactly $1,250 to his personal account every month. I categorized these payments in my ledger as an irrecoverable sunk cost. Sunk costs are past expenses that cannot be legally recovered. I stopped expecting a return on my forced investment. I instead focused entirely on understanding corporate failure patterns. I analyzed how incompetent leadership inevitably destroys complex capital structures. Harrison believed he was a visionary entrepreneur building a modern empire. I viewed him as a highly predictable depreciating asset. He was a walking statistical anomaly of unearned executive confidence. He assumed I was permanently defeated by their coordinated financial extraction. He did not realize I was systematically studying him. Harrison never understood the digital architecture required to move physical freight. 3 years ago he refused to pay an enterprise software developer. He claimed an external contractor would steal his proprietary business model. I stepped in to build his entire logistics routing database architecture. I utilized a secure server structure with advanced data integrations. This system automatically calculated the most efficient commercial delivery routes. I completed this massive technical project without any financial compensation. My mother praised Harrison for his brilliant budget management strategies. She completely ignored the 400 hours of labor I contributed. They assumed my technical contributions were simply standard family obligations. I installed a comprehensive software system for his corporate finance department. I configured the master administrator privileges using my own private credentials. I created a discrete secondary access node that bypassed standard authentication. I did not do this for any malicious reasons back then. I simply knew Harrison would inevitably lock himself out of the network. I maintained silent observation over his daily operational performance metrics. I watched every single invoice generate and every payroll transfer process. I possessed absolute visibility into his catastrophic cash flow mismanagement. My firm utilizes highly advanced predictive modeling software for risk assessment. I quietly imported his raw financial data into our corporate evaluation matrix. I applied a modified risk algorithm to his quarterly revenue earnings. This mathematical formula predicts the probability of a company entering bankruptcy. His numerical score dropped to a dismal fraction last November. Anything below a score of 2 indicates an impending financial collapse. He was effectively insolvent but continued operating through pure entrepreneurial delusion. I retained full control over his corporate email domain registry. I paid the annual renewal fee of exactly $145. Harrison never bothered to update the primary administrative billing contact. I legally owned the digital rights to his entire corporate identity. Revoking the domain registry would instantly destroy his internal communications. His logistics dispatchers would not receive any incoming freight delivery orders. His client portals would vanish entirely from the public internet. They took my silent infrastructure management completely for granted. They handed me the exact mechanisms to dismantle their fragile empire. I held the master keys to his entire operational existence. I monitored his failures from the safety of my cubicle. His business foundation was built entirely on my stolen labor. It was finally time to execute a structural demolition. The breaking point occurred on a Thursday at precisely 9:14 a.m. Harrison called me from a chaotic loading dock in downtown Dallas. He demanded an emergency transfer of exactly $12,500. He claimed 2 of his delivery vans were impounded for unpaid registration fees. He told me to use my personal credit line to secure their release. He did not ask for my help. He commanded me to fix his administrative failure. He reminded me that his success was our family's only priority. I hung up the phone and initiated the severance sequence. I opened the main domain registrar dashboard on my secondary monitor. I navigated to the domain name system configuration settings. I highlighted the primary AIR record that directed web traffic to his server. I deleted the record and clicked the Commit Changes button. This action instantly severed his company from the global internet. His corporate email addresses ceased to function immediately. His clients would receive fatal bounce-back errors when trying to contact dispatch. Next, I accessed his Amazon Web Services hosting environment. I possessed the root-level security tokens. I changed the master administrative password to a randomized 128-bit alphanumeric string. I terminated the active instances running his logistics routing database. I did not delete the data itself. Deleting data is a malicious act of corporate sabotage. I simply revoked his access credentials and locked the system architecture. His warehouse dispatchers were instantly blinded. They could not generate shipping manifests or track delivery drivers. The entire fleet of 20 commercial vans was now operating blindly. I moved to the financial software interface. I disabled the automated payroll distribution protocol. The system required secondary dual-factor authentication to reactivate. I routed that verification code directly to my personal encrypted device. His 72 employees would not receive their direct deposits on Friday morning. The Texas Workforce Commission handles unpaid wage claims with extreme severity. This single action would trigger a massive state-level audit within 3 business days. I sat back and watched the server traffic drop to absolute zero. The graphical interface turned from a healthy green to a flatline red. I felt my resting heart rate remain perfectly steady at 60 beats per minute. I was not angry about his arrogant demand for money. I was simply executing an overdue correction on a severely distressed asset. He had treated me like an infinite source of unearned capital. He assumed his position as the golden child protected him from consequences. He believed the infrastructure I built was his permanent property. He was about to learn the brutal reality of digital dependency. When you do not own the administrative layer, you own nothing. I closed the terminal and took a sip of cold brew coffee. The entire logistical network of his company was completely paralyzed. This was not an act of personal revenge. This was a calculated extraction of my critical operational resources. The absolute silence in my private office felt incredibly satisfying. I patiently waited for the inevitable corporate panic to finally begin. The first indicator of complete systemic failure manifested exactly 41 minutes later. My personal device registered 22 consecutive missed calls from Harrison. He then deployed our mother to bypass my ignored communications. She left a staggering 4-minute voicemail. Her tone oscillated between performative maternal concern and aggressive interrogation. She demanded to know why the corporate email servers were completely offline. She claimed Harrison was suffering from severe chest pains due to the immense stress. I analyzed the audio file for acoustic markers of genuine distress. The vocal pitch and cadence indicated standard manipulative fabrication. She was lying to force my compliance. Harrison escalated his tactics at exactly 11:30 a.m. He sent an automated text message through a third-party commercial platform. The message was precisely 100 words of pure, unadulterated entitlement. He threatened to file a civil lawsuit for malicious corporate sabotage. He cited a fictitious verbal contract regarding permanent technical support. I immediately archived the message into my secure evidentiary database. His threat was legally baseless and tactically foolish. A verbal agreement holds zero weight against documented server ownership records. I legally owned the domain registry. I legally purchased the AWS hosting instances under my own name. I was not sabotaging his company. I was simply turning off my own personal equipment. At 1:15 p.m. my mother attempted a direct physical confrontation. She arrived at the lobby of Vanguard Holdings. She bypassed the primary reception desk and demanded immediate access to my floor. She informed the security detail that it was an extreme family emergency. She expected me to rush downstairs in a panic. I simply instructed the head of security to deny her access. I cited strict corporate protocols regarding unauthorized visitors during active audits. She caused a significant public disturbance in the main atrium. She screamed that I was actively destroying my brother's life. The security cameras captured her entire outburst in high-definition video. I remotely downloaded the security footage from my growing compliance file. They believed their historical methods of emotional coercion would still work. They assumed I would fold under the pressure of maternal guilt and legal threats. They failed to recognize the fundamental shift in our power dynamic. I was no longer the subservient younger brother paying for their mistakes. I was a principal risk actuary executing a hostile operational freeze. Their panic was entirely predictable. When a failing business loses its primary administrative crutch, the collapse accelerates rapidly. Harrison was bleeding capital and losing client trust by the minute. His dispatchers were blind. His drivers were stranded. His payroll was locked. He was drowning in an ocean of his own managerial incompetence. I did not throw him a life preserver. I simply stood on the shoreline and documented his drowning process. I opened my digital ledger interface. I updated the operational loss probability matrix to exactly 99%. The escalation was failing completely. They desperately needed a new strategy to survive the weekend. I patiently waited for their very next predictable tactical misstep. I returned to my workstation at precisely 6 a.m. on Friday. The corporate servers were still completely offline. I initiated a secure virtual private network tunnel into Harrison's locked accounting database. My objective was to conduct a comprehensive forensic autopsy of his financial ledger. I bypassed the standard graphical interface. I used raw structured query language to extract his entire general ledger. I downloaded 34 months of transactional history into a secure local environment. I needed undeniable proof of his operational fraud. I wrote a custom Python script to identify duplicate invoicing patterns. The script ran for exactly 14 seconds. The results were mathematically catastrophic. Harrison was not just incompetent. He was actively committing commercial wire fraud. My algorithm discovered exactly 112 fabricated shipping invoices. He had been double billing his 3 largest enterprise clients for ghost deliveries. A ghost delivery is a freight shipment that never physically existed. He generated fake bill of lading documents using a digital template. He then routed the stolen funds into a secondary limited liability company. I pulled the state registration records for this shadow corporation. He named it Apex Logistics Consulting. He listed our mother as the primary registered agent. This legally implicated her in a multi-state federal racketeering scheme. I extracted the specific routing numbers for the shadow account. I matched them against his corporate expense reports. He was siphoning exactly $8,450.22 every 2 weeks. He used this stolen capital to lease a luxury penthouse overlooking the Colorado River. He categorized the lease as a critical business storage expense. I exported these specific fraudulent transactions into a pristine CSV file. I generated a SHA-256 cryptographic hash for the entire digital payload. This mathematical fingerprint proves the extracted data was never altered. It creates an unbroken chain of evidence for federal investigators. I burned the encrypted files onto a sterile solid-state drive. I continued my forensic audit into his human resources portal. He was severely misclassifying 22 full-time drivers as independent contractors. This is a deliberate violation of the Fair Labor Standards Act. He did this to avoid paying mandatory payroll taxes and workers' compensation premiums. His total state tax liability currently exceeded exactly $214,300. The Texas Comptroller does not negotiate with intentional corporate tax evaders. I added the payroll tax discrepancies to my master spreadsheet. Every row of data represented a guaranteed felony conviction. They believed I was just a bitter sibling throwing a digital tantrum. They assumed I would eventually restore server access to save the family name. They had no idea I was systematically preparing a federal indictment. I drafted an anonymous tip for the Securities and Exchange Commission whistleblower portal. I attached the hashed CSV files and the shadow corporation registration documents. I did not submit the form. I held it in a dormant state. I needed them to walk directly into the final snare. I locked the solid-state drive inside my fireproof biometric safe. The administrative trap was fully constructed. I poured a fresh cup of coffee. My breathing remained perfectly slow and deeply rhythmic today. The false truce materialized on Saturday at precisely 2 p.m. I was sitting at a corner table in an upscale Austin coffee shop. My secure biometric smartphone vibrated with an unexpected notification. My mother had somehow bypassed my digital perimeter. She approached my table wearing a carefully tailored designer suit. Harrison followed closely behind her like a severely reprimanded child. They did not shout or cause a public spectacle today. They employed a highly calculated display of artificial humility. My mother sat across from me and placed a manila folder on the table. She spoke with a soft, manufactured cadence designed to project deep maternal sorrow. She apologized for the immense pressure they had placed upon my shoulders. She claimed Harrison finally understood the absolute necessity of my technical infrastructure. Harrison stared at the floor and offered a perfectly rehearsed statement of regret. He admitted his logistics company was entirely dependent on my proprietary server architecture. He promised to formally hire me as his chief technology officer. He offered a starting base salary of exactly $125,000 per year. He even promised to issue 20% of the corporate equity shares directly to me. I analyzed their physiological baselines as they presented this fraudulent offer. My mother maintained unbroken eye contact while lightly tapping her left index finger. This is a documented somatic marker indicating severe internal anxiety. Harrison was sweating heavily despite the aggressive air conditioning in the cafe. They were terrified because the Texas Workforce Commission had just initiated their preliminary payroll audit. The manila folder contained a printed non-disclosure agreement and an employment contract. The contract included a deeply buried intellectual property clause. If I signed the document, I would legally surrender ownership of the domain registry. I would also transfer all AWS administrative credentials to his failing shadow corporation. They were attempting to acquire my leverage through a disguised corporate acquisition. I did not smile or express any overt satisfaction at their desperate maneuvering. I calmly opened the folder and read the specific legal terminology. The contract was drafted by a budget legal service and contained multiple glaring structural errors. I placed the document back onto the table and aligned it perfectly with the edge. I informed them that their proposed equity shares held a negative market value. I explained that 20% of a mathematically insolvent company equals absolute zero. Harrison lost his carefully manufactured composure immediately upon hearing my rejection. He slammed his fist onto the table and demanded the server passwords. My mother dropped her fake sorrow and hissed a deeply venomous insult. They realized I was no longer susceptible to their psychological extortion. I stood up and buttoned my tailored sport coat with precise deliberation. I told them to expect a formal legal summons on Monday morning. I walked out of the bustling coffee shop and stepped into the bright afternoon sunlight. I left them sitting there entirely trapped within the absolute ruin of their own financial disaster. The game was effectively over. The final corporate acquisition meeting occurred on Monday at precisely 10 o'clock in the morning. Harrison sat confidently in the primary conference room of Vanguard Holdings. He believed he was signing the final paperwork for a massive capital injection. My mother sat beside him wearing her triumphant designer suit. They assumed my presence meant I had surrendered to their weekend coercion. They believed I was attending simply to hand over the digital server infrastructure. The managing director of my risk evaluation firm sat at the head of the table. He asked Harrison to confirm the total projected quarterly revenue. Harrison lied fluently and stated the logistics fleet generated exactly $415,000 in gross revenue last month. I did not interrupt his fraudulent presentation. I simply connected my encrypted hard drive to the main presentation monitor. What is the exact moment you realized your abuser was completely powerless? Tell me the specific detail in the comments below. I projected his internal banking ledger onto the massive digital screen. I highlighted the 112 fabricated shipping invoices. I explained the mechanics of a ghost delivery scheme to the entire boardroom. A ghost delivery is a phantom shipment used entirely to launder stolen money. The managing director stopped taking notes and stared directly at my brother. Harrison began to stammer and claimed the data was illegally manipulated. I calmly handed the director the state registration for Apex Logistics Consulting. I pointed to the signature block confirming my mother as the primary registered agent. I explained how they siphoned exactly $8,450.22 every single 2 weeks. They used this stolen capital for a luxury penthouse lease instead of corporate payroll. The seasoned investors in the room immediately recognized the severe financial felony unfolding before them. My mother physically recoiled from the table and covered her mouth in absolute shock. I then displayed the massive discrepancy in his human resources portal. I detailed his deliberate misclassification of 22 full-time commercial drivers. I handed the printed confirmation of the active Texas Comptroller audit to the director. I stated that his total state tax liability currently exceeded exactly $214,300. The managing director immediately terminated the corporate acquisition meeting. He instructed our legal counsel to forward all internal files to the state authorities today. Harrison aggressively lunged across the polished mahogany table directly toward my secure workstation. Our private corporate security detail neutralized his physical advance in exactly 3 seconds. They escorted him forcefully out of the boardroom while he screamed pure venom. My mother remained completely frozen in her expensive chair as reality finally materialized. She finally understood the absolute difference between familial manipulation and corporate risk management. I systematically dismantled their entire fraudulent empire without raising my voice a single time. Their entitlement was entirely shattered by the undeniable weight of pure financial mathematics. I disconnected my encrypted hard drive and closed my laptop terminal with calculated precision. The massive boardroom was perfectly silent as the scent of their panic lingered heavily in the cold air. The systemic collapse of their fraudulent logistics empire executed with absolute mathematical precision. The managing director of Vanguard Holdings submitted my forensic dossier to the federal authorities. The Texas comptroller moved first on Tuesday morning. They initiated an immediate freeze on all corporate banking accounts tied to my brother. The state seized his entire fleet of 20 commercial delivery vans to satisfy the massive tax liability. Harrison could not access his ghost revenue to hire a competent criminal defense attorney. He was arrested by state investigators on Wednesday at exactly 6:15 in the morning. They apprehended him outside his luxury penthouse overlooking the Colorado River. The prosecution charged him with 22 counts of intentional tax evasion and commercial wire fraud. The presiding judge denied his initial bail request due to the overwhelming forensic evidence. He was permanently remanded to the county detention center to await his federal trial. My mother faced an equally devastating administrative destruction. The authorities immediately targeted her shell corporation known as Apex Logistics Consulting. She was the primary registered agent on all the fraudulent corporate filings. The state filed a comprehensive civil asset forfeiture claim against her personal estate. They placed a permanent lien on her primary residence to recover the stolen capital. She was forced to liquidate her remaining retirement portfolio just to secure legal representation. She moved out of her comfortable suburban home on a Friday afternoon. She relocated to a deeply undesirable rented apartment on the outer edge of the city. I monitored their complete financial destruction through the public municipal court digital portals. I did not feel any lingering resentment or emotional vindication today. Vindication is an emotional response requiring a personal attachment to the specific outcome. I simply viewed their legal ruin as a successfully completed corporate risk audit. The distressed asset was completely liquidated. The operational liability was permanently neutralized. Their historical strategy of emotional manipulation was completely useless against federal sentencing guidelines. Harrison was facing a mandatory minimum of 96 months in a federal penitentiary. My mother was completely stripped of her unearned wealth and manufactured social status. The toxic family dynamic was finally eradicated through the application of absolute structural reality. I closed the judicial tracking software on my primary workstation. The final phase of my severance protocol was successfully deployed and perfectly functioning. I walked toward the break room to pour a cup of coffee. The final corporate bankruptcy documents were formally processed exactly 2 days ago. I did not attend the liquidation hearing. My deliberate physical absence was the ultimate confirmation of his complete irrelevance. I purchased his seized digital domain registry for exactly $300 in cash. I acquired this asset during the mandatory state liquidation auction on Friday afternoon. I did not reactivate the corporate servers. I permanently redirected all incoming commercial web traffic to a completely static error screen. It displays a simple server timeout message. This digital tombstone is a permanent public monument to his severe administrative failure. Vanguard Holdings officially promoted me to the Senior Managing Director position earlier this week. I now directly oversee a global portfolio valued at exactly $400 million. True peace is not a fragile emotion. It is never dependent on toxic family validation or conditional approval. Absolute peace is a fully secure internal network with zero compromised external access points. I successfully quarantined their parasitic financial influence using pure operational leverage. I replaced their emotional manipulation with strict mathematical boundaries. How did you permanently sever the unauthorized malicious users from your own private network infrastructure? Please type your exact operational firewall strategy in the comments down below. I sat quietly in my modern corner executive office. I watched the heavy Austin City traffic crawl along the interstate highway. My healthy resting heart rate remained a perfectly steady 60 beats per minute. The comprehensive risk audit of my flawed family dynamic is permanently closed. The deeply distressed asset was completely liquidated. The operational liability was entirely removed from my balance sheet forever. I finally locked my highly encrypted primary workstation. I stood up, adjusted my tailored suit jacket, and confidently walked out of the completely silent room.